You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 18th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
1 year ago, we met in the Woodside Summit in San Francisco, and I'm very proud of the progress we both made together.
After Apec, now the G20. The world's most powerful leaders head to Brazil, where once again China and the prospect of President-elect Trump will no doubt be shaping the agenda. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes. We find out how violence surrounding a football match in central Amsterdam nearly brought down the Dutch government. We'll hear about 6 major storms hitting the Philippines in 3 weeks, examining the country's ability to withstand such an onslaught by nature. We'll go through Monday's newspapers, look at the latest business headlines, and find out about a French dictionary that's taken 8 decades to produce. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The US has authorized Ukraine's military to use long-range American missiles to strike deep inside Russia. Meanwhile, parts of Ukraine are experiencing blackouts following a wide-ranging Russian missile and drone attack this weekend, targeting the country's power infrastructure. And the media chief of the Lebanese militia group Hezbollah has been killed in an Israeli strike in Beirut. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, 2 major summits within a week in South America are giving the world's most powerful leaders ample opportunity to contemplate their positions and focus on what they want from 2025. Apec saw the final meeting between the outgoing US president and his Chinese counterpart, where warnings were given about a potential Cold War between the two nations. Well, now everybody's decamped to Brazil for the G20. And to tell us more, I'm joined now by Antonio Sampaio, who's an expert on Brazilian politics and security at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, and by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute. A very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Isabel, let us begin with you, because before we move on to the G20, we have to sort of round off APEC. And this was the moment when we saw the outgoing US President Joe Biden sit down with Xi Jinping for 2 tense hours. Well, we don't know whether it's 2 tense hours, but what do we know what happened at their meeting?
Well, it was described as frank, so I think we can assume that it was fairly tense. That's usually the diplomatic euphemism. The 2 men, of course, know each other, as well as global leaders do know each other. When they were both vice presidents, they met several times, actually. So, this is not the first meeting by any means, but it is the last. And I think that the real subject of the meeting was the person who wasn't there, Donald Trump. Joe Biden took China to task, took Xi Jinping to task over Taiwan. He reiterated that the United States was not advocating Taiwanese independence, but would definitely support a peaceful settlement and oppose a military one. He complained about continuing Chinese cyber attacks. A statement of the US positions. He was positive about the resumption of contacts and some progress on drug trafficking. From Xi Jinping's side, he basically reiterated the Chinese position that Taiwan was no business of the United States, nor was human rights, nor democracy, and cyber attacks, not us. So, it was very much a restatement of positions. You're the problem, not me. Not terribly positive, but it lasted 2 hours, so I guess something good happened. And they did praise each other for the continuing or the restoration rather, of regular contacts after the pandemic. And both of them said how important it was that that continue. Whether it will, that remains to be seen.
Staying with you, Isabel, for the moment, just explore a little bit more about the fact that you mentioned that Trump is on the way. We'll come to that in a moment. But first and foremost, the Biden era has seen very, very strong steps made against China on trade. I mean, where does the Biden era leave the relationship with China?
Well, essentially, Biden did not unwind any of the measures on trade that Trump had initiated. And there has been a sense that China policy has been, bipartisan. It's one of the very few issues in US politics these days which goes across the aisle. Nevertheless, there are doubts, and there are certainly doubts about the US commitment to Taiwan under Donald Trump, because he has complained, as he has, over the cost of defending Taiwan, and why doesn't Taiwan pay the bill, and all this kind of thing. The other, I think, quite important factor is that Donald Trump is not noted for his tact or interest in the wider relationships. And one important part of Biden's China policy has been building very strong relationships with Japan and South Korea, countries in the region that would play a very important role and be deeply concerned were there to be a problem in Taiwan. And, Trump he has contempt, it would appear, for wider relationships. He likes to think that if it's a bilateral, if he's in the room, then, he will come out the winner. That is very much not the case over Taiwan. So there is reason to suppose that the Chinese will test him really quite early on over the South China Sea, over Taiwan. There is a very, very dangerous situation developing on the Korean Peninsula. And given that Trump met Kim Jong-un last time he was president and got absolutely nothing out of it, there's not a lot of confidence in the region that he's going to handle an increasingly complicated situation.
Antonio, let's move on to the fact that Apec has now finished and they're all arriving in Brazil. I think Xi Jinping arrived about 3 hours ago. Tell us what the mood is like in terms of the setup for the G20, because obviously it comes at a time when eyes are very much looking at China and the US and what the US will do once Trump arrives at the White House.
Yes, exactly. Continuing on the same line as my colleague, the looming Trump arrival on the world scene or return to the world scene is really affecting the mood throughout this process of the G20. And indeed, many comments that were made off the record or anonymously to the press by especially Brazilian diplomats and other negotiators at the G20 is that of a very low mood, a very disheartened mood, because there's a lot of work being put into very ambitious and large-scale diplomatic initiatives in this G20, such as a global alliance to fight hunger, a massive financial bill for climate change to developing countries. And the impression or the expectation is that much of that, if not all, will be fornigh if when Trump arrives and with his traditional disregard or disinterest for relations abroad, as was said before. So the mood is that of apprehension, but work does go on, and there are some interesting initiatives such as a tax on the super rich that has support even from developed countries such as Spain that is being negotiated. But again, the mood with Trump returning to the world scene is of apprehension and uncertainty.
Tell us a little bit about the role of Brazil in all this, Antonio. I mean, how it sits with the fact that it works very well with China. It has worked well with Biden and now has to play host to a very delicate period.
Yes, Brazil has always prided itself on being a bridge between the global north and the global south. And Lula himself, President Lula, is very engaged and interested in world affairs, which is not the case with many other Brazilian presidents in recent decades. And he himself has adopted a very active stance on talking about Ukraine and even proposing possible solutions in their views that were not by any means taken well by Western countries, but it does see itself as a leader or as a sort of moral leader of developing nations, global south, and was one of the founding members of the BRICS group of large developing economies. So it does have very good relations with China, and these relations have been improving actually in recent times. President Xi Jinping is in Rio for the G20, and immediately after that, he will engage in a state visit to Brazil, visiting Brasilia, partially to celebrate the 50-year anniversary of diplomatic relations between Brazil and China. He also penned an op-ed at the Folha de São Paulo newspaper yesterday, praising the cultural ties, including through Brazilian telenovelas in China and other cultural items. Brazil is a very, very large exporter of food, of agricultural products such as soybeans and chicken, and China is a voracious consumer of that. So that complementarity in trade items is a reason for good relations. And again, the looming Trump effect on the world stage is only increasing the importance of this relationship with China and increasing the importance of the expanded BRICS group as a forum for diplomatic negotiations, economic governance, trying to append the dollar as the predominant coin for trade, and all these sort of multipolarity attempts that are multiplying in recent years.
Finally, Antonio, briefly, if you wouldn't mind, there's a prospect of the Argentinian president Javier Milei throwing a real spanner in the works this week, isn't there?
Indeed. Argentina is now, we kept talking about the looming Trump effect. Actually, President Milei of Argentina is serving as sort of a proxy for Trump in many ways, because he recently had a discussion, a chat with Trump, and Argentina had agreed a few months ago to the agreement that was a document that setting out a tax on the super rich, or a defense by the G20 for a tax on the wealth of the super rich. And President Milei actually changed his mind in recent weeks and threatened to not sign that declaration, which puts the entire G20 communiqué under threat, because they might have to add footnotes throughout the document because of Argentina, or even withdraw Argentina, or Argentina withdraw itself from the document. So in many cases, such as the climate finance, the negotiations at the COP29 have been very difficult, and many countries have looked to the G20 for an agreement from developed nations to provide some funding for small developing nations for climate mitigation. And that is another item that Argentina has shown skepticism towards.
Antonio Sampaio, thank you very much indeed. And thanks also to Isabel Hilton. You're listening to The Globalist. 8:13 in Amsterdam, 7:13 here in London. Now, the violence in the Netherlands when Maccabi Tel Aviv played Ajax last week has horrified people around the world. It also almost brought down the country's government. The coalition is led by the anti-Muslim populist party PVV of Geert Wilders, who repeatedly said Dutch youth of Moroccan descent were the main attackers of the Israeli fans. Well, his statements prompted at least one cabinet member to resign and fear that the government would collapse. So, what happened? Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Stefan de Vries, who's a European affairs correspondent for Euronews and BNR News Radio based in Amsterdam. Welcome back, Stefan. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
So could you just briefly recap what happened that night and the effect that it had on the way that the government responded?
Well, allegedly, last week, the ministers in the ministerial council, the weekly meeting of the ministers, some of the ministers used some very explicit and racist talk about what, according to them, was happening in the Netherlands. There was apparently there were especially the Moroccans in the Netherlands were targeted by some ministers. And this pushed the minister, one of the junior ministers of finance, to resign. She's of Moroccan descent, Nora Aghabar. And she said that she could no longer live and work in a government that is so openly racist. Nora Aghabar was a member of the NSC party, which is a new party in the Netherlands and part of the coalition, the four-party coalition, and won or had success at the elections with a program where they defended, or said they were going to defend the rule of law, the constitution, and making the Netherlands more equal and egalitarian, and also respecting the law. Well, it's quite ironic now that this is the only minister of Moroccan descent in the government, and she is now the only one defending actually fundamental rights. The government was about to collapse because it was a big question on Friday whether her fellow party members of the NSC also decided to leave as a sign of solidarity. But at the end of the day, they decided not to. And the government of Dick Schoof, basically the one who is in charge of the government, but gets his orders from Geert Wilders, the populist party leader of the PVV. The government did not collapse, but it's once again a big crisis. And it also shows the presence of very racist, extreme right elements, members in the current government, although the Prime Minister on late Friday night, repeatedly said that there was no racism in his cabinet. But when he said that, he clearly looked rather lost, and his words didn't sound very credible. Now, this is the current situation. The government has been saved, is still there, but this crisis is one of many. You have to know that the government, this government only started in July, so that's just 4 months ago, and there have been many crises already, but this seems that this is the crisis too much, and it's very unlikely, or it's quite possible that this government will not survive the end of the year.
And we did just explain to us what could happen next, given the fact that we do have this four-way coalition. It is made up of people with very, very different opinions on how the Netherlands should be governed. And as you say, there has been this list of difficult incidences which have culminated in this night of violence in Amsterdam.
Yes, absolutely. The events on the night in Amsterdam when Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters started fighting in Amsterdam on the night before a match against Ajax Amsterdam, that already put the city on tension. Then the next night, youngsters and allegedly also taxi drivers organized themselves to beat up the supporters, but they also used words like the Jew hunt. We have to punish the Jews. Now, of course, this is all. This is not an excuse. The behavior of the Maccabi supporters in Amsterdam is not an excuse for what happened the next day, of course. But it did trigger the Dutch politicians to say that there is a huge integration problem in the Netherlands. Now, a couple of days later, the facts were far more, let's say, not as black as white as they were presented on Friday morning, when the whole world looked in shock at Amsterdam. Words like Kristallnacht and new pogroms were being used. The situation was very complex and much more nuanced than just a hunt on Jews. But this was a trigger for especially the government, the right-wing populist government in the Netherlands, to say we have a problem with all people from particularly Muslim a background, immigration descent. Also, people who have been born or whose parents have been born already in the Netherlands, third generation immigrants. And this caused a major debate. And apparently, according to the minister who resigned, there was absolute racist slur in the government meetings. And nobody's really surprised, of course, because the biggest party in the coalition, the PVV, especially his leader, or it's actually not a real party because there are no party members, there's just Geert Wilders, has been known for many, many years to be a racist, anti-Muslim party. So it is not a surprise, but the fact that apparently a minister who's in charge of defending the constitutional safety and the rule of law is now the one who is to resign. But it shows that there's a big problem with this Dutch government. There's also another issue. If this government had resigned on Friday night, there would have been new elections, probably within the next 2 or 3 months. But in the current polls, Geert Wilders is actually even higher than at the last elections that took place exactly a year ago. So the Netherlands would be stuck with the same situation after these elections again. But it shows how chaotic Dutch politics has become over the last 10, 15 years. The country is very heavily polarized, and nobody has the answer to what should happen. Now, many politicians and also people from NGOs and from society are calling to organize a big debate, to stay in touch, to understand each other, and not let politicians divide them. But it's clear that this is absolutely a watershed in political history of the Netherlands.
Stefan de Vries, thank you so much for joining us as ever on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
There are risks in AI, and it's really important that a company not choose to completely not participate, but rather start building for the risk. The responsible AI framework, the ethics community, the top-down leadership in terms of how AI is a strategic part of their business and how they expect it to fit in.
Google's René Lowe talks to Monocle Radio about the future of AI. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:22 here in London. Let's have a look at Monday's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Simon Brooke, journalist and communications consultant. How is life in the Brooke world this morning? Good morning to you,
Good
Simon.
morning to you. Very good to see you. Yes, slightly chaotic due to a new dog, but other than that, going swimmingly.
Forget the papers. Who's the dog?
The dog is called Finn. He's an Irish dog, just under 2, according to the rescue people. We're not completely sure, but anyway, as I was getting up and trying to prepare to do the newspapers, he thought it'd be a great idea to play at 5:30 in the morning.
Who doesn't think it's a good idea to play at 5:30 in the morning? Just quickly, before we dive into the papers, if I remember of note, is this dog 2?
Nearly, apparently.
Nearly dog
roughly.
2.
Sorry, number 2. Dog number 2, correct.
Nearly dog number 2. And I remember a couple of years ago when dog number 1 arrived in the Brooke household, there was a massive shaking of heads on your part. So how have 2 arrived?
I'm just completely won over to dogs, Emma, to be honest. It's really weird. I never, always having been brought up in not just in a non-dog family, but a sort of anti-dog family. Now I'm convinced.
Brooke kennels to come soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you for that update. Right, so let's have a look at the papers. What seems to have happened is that the papers have caught the announcement that Biden has said yes to Ukraine using American long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia. This has actually made it to all the front pages of the paper editions, at least.
Yeah, so exactly. So the New York Times is one of a number of news outlets reporting that, as you say, Joe Biden has authorized the first use of US-supplied long-range missiles by Ukraine inside Russia, according to US officials that have briefed the paper and other news outlets. So these initially will be used against Russian and North Korean troops for the defense of Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region in western Russia, according to these officials. And I think the North Korean element is really important because, according to the New York Times, the idea of this decision is to send a message to the North Koreans that their forces are vulnerable, according to the New York Times, and that the government of North Korea should not send more. The paper reminds us that the Russian military is launching a major assault by what is thought to be about 50,000 soldiers, including those North Korean troops, on dug-in Ukrainian positions in Kursk. And the idea is to retake all of the Russian territory that the Ukrainians seized in August. So it does look towards the end of Biden's term as if suddenly he's increasing upping the ante.
This has been running since the beginning of the Russian invasion in February 2022, hasn't it? Because some Pentagon officials were thinking, firstly, the US Army has limited supplies of long-range missiles of this kind, but also we have had several times iterations from Moscow, from Vladimir Putin, saying if America permits this to happen, this is now a NATO country getting directly involved. Well, it's a line.
It is, exactly, and has that line been crossed? Absolutely. I mean, the New York Times reports that the decision to do this has divided the president's advisors. Yes, exactly. And according to the paper, some are concerned that it could provoke Putin to use force against other troops, and it concerns that it has increased the level of aggression. But I think there's perhaps a feeling that in his last few months in office, the president's got to do what he can to try and help the Ukrainians. And there is a feeling to some extent that he's always had this policy of not upsetting Putin too much, that Putin must lose, but not in a way that could humiliate him. So that policy does seem to have changed according to this latest decision.
And it seems a very last-minute thing, given the fact that the sun is setting on the Biden administration. The Ukrainians will be very grateful for this, and they have expressed their gratitude. But one does wonder whether this sort of sunset gesture is too late.
Well, exactly. It's the last roll of the dice. And I was talking to an American politician a couple of weeks ago who was saying, to some extent, is there a feeling now that, and I think this perhaps might fit into this, that in a way you could do what you want now, really, because to some extent you're leaving it all in the hands of a new Trump administration. And is there any reason why Joe Biden would want to make things better for Donald Trump when he takes office? So if Trump really can end the war in 24 hours, as he boasted so many times on the election campaign trail, without saying how he'd do it. I think there's perhaps a feeling amongst the White House. Well, go on then. Here you go. It's over to you now.
Let's move to France, where there's an article in Le Monde, isn't there, about a real boost in the amount of money being spent on the military, on arms. Yeah,
so the reporter is going to visit a military site in the west of France, Moribond, and there's a report, saying that despite budgetary constraints, arms spending is soaring, according to Le Monde. And I think it's interesting, this piece makes the point that there is a need to invest more in defence. But on the other hand, there are other calls on the budget. And of course, France is running a huge budget deficit and it is in a very tight financial situation. The paper reminds us that it was back in June 2022 that Emmanuel Macron said that France must switch to a war economy. Gosh, which seems so sort of prescient, given that what we've seen now with the Russian economy, totally 40% of public spending on defence and security matters. So, this piece looks at how France can increase its defence capability within these very tight budgets, and it's not easy.
There was an article, I can't remember where I read it last week, about how France is now going to defence industry workers who have retired to create a defence industrial reserve. Effectively labour that knows what it's doing, and it can ramp up production of weapons and armaments. that sort of opens two new areas, doesn't it? A, the fact that France is willing to go back and look at retired workers to try and bring them in, but also the fact that it is actively investing in the production of arms.
Yeah, absolutely. But how do you do that? I mean, this piece in the Le Monde is pointing out that France may well hold the rank of second arms exporter in the world, but its soldiers, sailors and pilots lack ammunition and sometimes basic equipment. And this is the situation in the site that this reporter has visited, where apparently more than half of the Cayman fleet is grounded for lack of spare parts. So, yeah, do you really have the resources in terms of human capabilities and also finances to meet this ambition?
Finally, let's move on to a story in the Times. Simon, are you a bicycle rider?
I am a bicycle rider. And and the funny thing is that normally, as you know, Emma, I am a placid sort of bloke.
You are.
Very relaxed, very easygoing. Once I get in the saddle, or as I said to you in our note before the programme, get in the salad apparently, but I meant the saddle. I'm a bit of a demon, and this is an interesting piece. I'm quite conflicted with this because I do think that these Lime bikes, I think providing people with bikes that they can pick up and use is great. I mean, it's the future.
This is the e-bike that you just click with your phone and you jump on and off you go.
Absolutely.
And it turns the sort of the mild-mannered janitor of Simon Brooke into. Well, what happens to you and why?
Just don't try and overtake me on a bike, Emma, is all I say. I'm always first off at the lights. But even that's I do wait for the lights, but Sean Russell in the in the Times is pointing out that many bike riders don't even do that. They just go anyway. So it's, as I say, it's an interesting conflict. On the one hand, these alternative, low carbon, easily accessible bikes that allow us to get physically fit must be a good thing. But gosh, why are people, when it comes to the bikes that you can just pick off the street and log into, why are people such monsters?
Well, I think what the article is saying is that this thing charges you 72p a minute, whether you're moving or not. And as a result, that you feel as if life is on a meter.
Yeah.
And the issue is that when you have people who, I think we've all increasingly seen the number of people who aren't wearing helmets, who aren't following the road. It is that funny thing that there is an inherent freedom to picking up a rented bicycle.
That's part of the joy of it.
Yet the fact is you don't actually have to be any good at reading the road to do it.
Or know anything about road signs, road safety, anything at all like that. You just go for it.
There is the wider question, isn't there, that the rented bike is brilliant, but one wonders whether you just see them all beautifully lined up in various smaller cities. But when London suddenly tries to convert itself into a cycling city, it is how London creates a peaceful cycling space is an enormous challenge, isn't it?
It's so difficult. I think we're slightly reaching a tipping point now where London is more of a cycling city, but still that conflict between bikes and cars really is frightening. And as you say, it would be nice to see these rental bikes under any brand lined up on the pavement, wouldn't it? But very often you see somebody just literally throw them on the ground, or you hear that clicking sound, which apparently means because somebody's basically nicked one and is cycling anyway, even though they haven't rented it and logged in.
Okay, so if you see a very tall, angry man on a rented Lime bike, it's Simon Brooke, ladies and gentlemen. Simon, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 7:32. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The US has authorized Ukraine's military to use long-range American missiles to strike deep inside Russia. It marks a major change in policy for the White House. Moscow has previously warned that such a move would be seen as a direct participation of NATO countries in the Ukraine war. Meanwhile, parts of Ukraine are experiencing blackouts following a wide-ranging Russian missile and drone attack targeting the country's power infrastructure over the weekend. At least 10 people were killed in the strikes, which hit multiple targets. And the media chief of the Lebanese militia group Hezbollah has been killed in an Israeli strike in Beirut. Most of the headquarters of the Lebanese branch of the Syrian Ba'ath Party was also destroyed in the strike, which killed Mohammed Afif. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, any country, regardless of its preparedness, would be tested by the arrival of a major storm. People living in the Philippines, however, have experienced no fewer than 6 typhoons in the last 3 weeks, with more than 160 people losing their lives and significant damage to a country that doesn't have time to clear up after one catastrophic weather event before another one arrives. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Richard Haydarian, an academic and columnist for the Philippines Daily Inquirer. A very good morning to you, Richard.
Good morning. As always, a pleasure.
So thank you very much indeed for joining us. So Typhoon Man-yi is the latest to slam into the Philippines. I mean, what's life been like in the last couple of days at least?
Well, I'm based in Manila, so we were expecting some sort of landfall, but luckily before midnight last night, we saw an update that mentioned that there was some sort of a change in the trajectory of the latest storm, so there wasn't as much rain in this part of the country. Nevertheless, the damage was significant in parts of the country that were already heavily damaged, like Catanduanes, which is a very small island facing the Philippine Sea in the Western Pacific, and also some of our more northern provinces were also severely affected by these things. As you correctly mentioned, I mean, my goodness, we never had something like this. You know, we have up to 20 major storms every year, but having them back to back, 6 of them in just few weeks. And in the case of Catanduanes, they already were, trying to just survive and come out of the ashes of former storms, particularly Storm Christina a few weeks ago. This is really tragic and overwhelming. Hence, you had President Marcos Jr. The other month quite inartfully saying, because this was, of course, weaponized by their enemies, including the Dutertes, saying that we're almost helpless here. This is just too much and overwhelming for any country, for that matter, especially for a developing country like the Philippines.
So just explain to us, I mean, how things are being operated, run in whatever way possible when you have 6 storms back to back.
Well, I mean, this is something that a lot of climate scientists have been warning for quite some time, that part of climate change is not just more droughts. Actually, this year was far drier and hotter than the previous one, which in itself was a record. It's heading towards Christmas in the Philippines, but it still feels hot. It feels like, more Q3 of the year. The other thing was also extreme weather events are going to be much more frequent and much more unpredictable, right? Including their trajectory and intensity. Remember the Philippines, almost exactly a decade ago during the Haiyan or Yolanda superstorm, we suffered from the impact of the worst superstorm in more than 50 years. And the fear we have is that we're going to have more of those superstorms. Now, in some communities like Catanduanes, for instance, there was so much desperation to avoid deaths. As you mentioned, there were more than 160 people killed in previous weeks that, residents are being warned of being arrested. That the governments are getting so desperate to take them to, evacuation centers that they're using more and more draconian measures. So obviously the way forward for the Philippines is to typhoon proof its basic infrastructure. But even in that area, we have had problems. So we spend billions of dollars, by some estimate, between $5 to $6 billion on flood control, for instance, infrastructure over the past decade. But they have failed big time because of corruption, because there's no scrutiny of how those flood control projects have been conducted. So this is where you see an unfortunate convergence of, Mother Nature getting more ferocious because of climate change, but also the governance structure in the Philippines not really catching up with the minimum needed. So really the best hope of people is just to move to evacuation centers and hunker down and hope that things don't go too crazy.
Finally, briefly, the Filipino finance minister was at COP last week saying that they need to create or shore up a global climate change war chest. I mean, what is the likelihood of more money coming the Philippines' way?
Well, absolutely. Honestly, we have seen countries like Maldives or smaller island nations who could face annihilation and existential threat. They're the ones who have been at the forefront of this, but more mid-sized developing countries, I mean, the Philippines is about to become an upper middle income country, are also joining the voice. And in the case of the Philippines, to be honest, I think we're also hoping to get more direct assistance from our key security allies. I mean, much of our interviews in this show has been about security matters. And guess what? The Americans deployed humanitarian relief, and American military has been involved in this. So I think the Philippines will push internationally for more development assistance, for more mitigation adaptation. But I think more, realistically, it's going to lean on key allies like Japan and the United States to be front and center in helping logistically and financially in the coming years and so.
Richard Haydarian, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. It's 15:38 in Singapore, 8:38 a.m. in Zurich, and there's a mix of hype and fear surrounding artificial intelligence these days, both for consumers and for investors who are trying to figure out exactly where AI advances fit the best into their businesses. Well, Renee Lowe is the regional director of Google based in Singapore, and she spoke to Monocle's Asia editor James Chambers at last week's UBS Australasia conference in Sydney. James began by asking whether for investors Renee has been speaking to, AI matches the hype.
I think when you look at the different technologies that have come out over the last years, there's only a couple that have come into prominence so quickly. The internet, for one, mobile, for one, and now Gen AI. And so I think in my many years of working, this is probably one of the fastest paced growth and pickups in at least the last 5-10 years. Now, when that happens, sometimes the world is not ready for it. Right, so I would say some of it definitely is hype, but a lot of it is also real. And in the last 12 months, a lot of that has shook out, such that the hype has died down. And now we're really talking about what goes into production, what will actually stay, and what was a lot of noise, a lot of cost, and a lot of flash, but ultimately didn't have an impact for businesses.
Interesting that you used those three examples, because obviously the internet and mobile phones have absolutely changed our lives, transformed our lives. So, I mean, are you suggesting that AI has that potential, and how soon will we know?
Well, I think we're feeling it already. Recently, a Vodafone business report said that over 51% of organizations in APAC have adopted Gen AI in some way. But I think the interesting thing is when you look at those three technologies, none of them are destinations. They're all paths to some level of productivity, some level of usage. And so I think from the internet perspective, it links you to knowledge, right? From a mobile perspective, it links knowledge to you at any point of, wherever you are geographically. And I think AI is going through that same evolution where it used to be a destination. Like, hey, I'm going to go to this AI tool and ask it some questions and get some answers. And that's more of treating AI as a destination. But I think ultimately for AI to live up to its hype, it needs to be integrated in every part of the business processes, into the lives of individuals. And so it's no longer a destination, but something that is just immersive through every aspect of our life.
Where's it going to touch us, the regular people, the consumers, in the next 12 months? Because there's a lot of AI being used behind the scenes at the back end, and we don't even know about it. We don't even need to know about it. But in terms of how we're going to see it and feel it, besides the tools you've mentioned, which you could see as a kind of an iteration of the internet anyway, what's coming down in the pipeline?
Yeah, so I think you're correct in that there's a lot of AI in the background for at least the last 10 years, right? I've led AI teams at Microsoft, I've led AI teams at AWS. A lot of it is behind the scenes efficiency that just serves our customers better. I think you're going to see a lot more agentic AI in front of individuals themselves, right? Take, for example, in Singapore, the government has quite a bit of investment in supporting Gen AI in the country. Now, half of that is digital infrastructure, but the other half is consumer upskilling, investing in its local businesses, and it really is getting that in front of individuals into the forefront. Just give you one example. Badminton is essentially a national sport in Singapore. And in the past, for us to schedule a badminton court, sometimes you have to go physically in person and fill in a book. Sometimes somewhere online, you got to keep on hitting refresh at midnight and hope to God you get that spot. And now they have rolled out a Gen AI agent where essentially you can now talk to the agent about your preferences, about your locations, your times of days, perhaps even your skill level or whatnot, and then go all the way through scheduling in the end. And so I think all of these are actually exposed to the end user very purposefully for helping them go on the journey of Gen AI. We see a lot of this from a customer experience perspective, whether it is the call centers that we hit. And I know once I say that, there's a lot of frustration that people feel where you're getting put on hold forever or going in endless loops and cycles. But at the end of the day, with Gen AI coming into that space, it can bring more empathy, it can bring more solution, it can bring more empowerment, both from a customer who's calling in and an agent perspective. And so I think we will interface more and more with Gen AI. What we will see, however, is the Gen AI you see today will be coupled with a human being, augmented by a human being, either the end consumer or the person using Gen AI to become more productive.
And finally, there are a lot of people telling us to be excited about AI, and there are a lot of people telling us to fear AI and run for the hills because the robots are going to kill us. What's your view? What's the Google view of AI?
From my view, I would say that we have to be very clear about the use case we are trying to solve, and we put the human back into the center of the use case itself. I think what I fear is sometimes when AI is just this broad-based thing, you can do anything under the sun, and then it just runs wild. We've seen some of this over the last year. And so I think when I talk to organizations, it's really around, let's talk about the challenge that we're trying to solve, right? And let's get to how does that benefit the employees? How does that benefit your customers? How does that benefit the organization? And even more importantly so is, how do you do that in a sustainable way, right? Have you actually built out a responsible AI framework? Do you have an ethics committee? Do you have all of those different pieces? Because what I fear is AI is just a tool, right? And you can use it one way or the other. Now, if you don't use it at all, others are using it anyway, right? So then we're just kind of falling behind. But we just have to be very thoughtful in terms of how we're using this tool. And when there's any doubt, to just pause, get it with ethics committee, and make sure that we feel that from a responsibility perspective, from a fairness and bias perspective, from an explainability perspective, those fundamental pieces are there. And so that's actually why when we have conversations, sometimes folks are saying, hey, Renee, you're talking about fairly common use cases. They sound like low-hanging fruit or whatnot. Let's go do that crazy thing. And I was like, okay, first of all, these pieces have been very vetted. I can get you the ROI quickly within 6 months. Those other pieces, yes, it's super interesting, very innovative, but we have to talk about what are the implications of doing so. What precisely are you trying to solve, and what are the risks around it? So I totally agree. There are risks in AI, and it's really important that a company not choose to completely not participate, but rather start building for the responsible AI framework, the ethics community, the top-down leadership in terms of how AI is a strategic part of their business and how they expect it to fit in.
Renee Lowe there, talking to Monocle's James Chambers. You're listening to The Globalist. Time now to talk business with Vicky Price, economist and former joint head of the UK government's Economic Service. A very good morning to you, Vicky.
Good morning.
Right. Explain to us, there's an article in the Reuters which is effectively dishing out advice to the United Kingdom about which way it should pivot once Donald Trump gets into office.
Yes, this is quite interesting. Well, there's been such a big debate, of course, right now because of the increase in tariffs, which is expected to happen when Trump becomes, takes over as president in the new year, which is concerning, of course, everyone, including what's going on or will be going on in Brazil under the G20, a meeting which is also going to be focusing very much on what happens next. And of course, Biden will be there. And so it's going to be very interesting. And of course, the question for the UK, being a sort of independent island, open, not belonging to the EU any longer or being part of the EU any longer, but also thinking it has a special relationship with the US. What does it do if indeed there is any change in trade relations with the US and China, the US and Europe, and those tariffs are indeed imposed? Will it go with the US or will it go with Europe? And there is a big debate going on right now in the UK as to whether perhaps Brexit needs to be revisited. Should we in fact be thinking of how we can get closer to Europe again and face this threat together? Well, Stephen Moore, who is an advisor, I presume still, to Trump, he's saying that the decision needs to be made between whether the UK should opt for the socialist model of economy which the EU has, or be a much more liberal capitalist country aligning itself with the US much more. So it's an interesting debate, which so far hadn't quite entered the type of discussion that has been going on in the UK in terms of sort of state involvement and so on. And given that, in fact, the UK with the new government has, as a result of the budget and all the moves it's now be making, increasing the share of the state in the economy, becoming much, much more actually like the Europeans. It's an interesting time to make that type of comparison between the two. And of course, we do have a socialist, inverted commas, government.
It's an interesting, it's an interesting situation insofar as it is the Trump administration there, which is talking about a country's values, not its economic structure and economic needs, but to tell the United Kingdom, which path it needs to take is a very interesting one.
It is, but of course, it's not the administration that's doing it. First of all, we don't have the administration yet, and of course, the person who's been saying it, Stephen Moore, is described as a senior economic advisor. What's going to happen, after the actual inauguration and when Trump takes over is a big question mark. But one imagines that there is some element of what Trump thinks as well, which is coming out of those words. So it remains to be seen.
And let's also look about the context in which the United Kingdom finds itself. We've seen GDP declining. We have seen fears about inflation mount as well. So the United Kingdom is not in the strongest position where it can actually pick and choose too much, can it?
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, you could argue neither is Europe, of course, right now. Nevertheless, Europe managed to grow by 0.4%, I think, in the third quarter when the UK grew by just 0.1%. And that's a real concern because what had happened over the last few months is that everyone has been quite worried about the impact of the budget, which then happened in October the 30th. So things may get worse from here on. But even during the summer, because everyone was very hesitant, uncertain, what we saw in September was a drop in GDP, a fall of 0.1%, which was a bit of a worry. If those trends continue, then it suggests that perhaps this year isn't going to be anything like as good as some of the forecasts have been suggesting. So we are really talking from a position of relative weakness, and businesses have already reacted negatively to some of the measures introduced in the budget of October 30th. So yes, any increase in the cost of doing business and trade is going to be pretty bad for the economy. There's no doubt about that. But of course, I mean, the question is, what's going to happen elsewhere too? The general expectations is that Trump's increases in tariffs, 60%, if indeed it happens, additional on China and 10 to 20% on everyone else, will slow the world economy, will increase inflation. And yes, inflation may be picking up a little bit here in the UK from very low 1.7%. We've seen that happen in Europe. It went up to 2% for October. We'll get the latest data soon for the UK as well. But those tariffs will actually make things worse and also slow the global economy. So there are decisions to be made, and I think they will be overshadowing the G20 meeting as well.
How are markets and the world of finance and reacting to this impending threat of trade and tariffs and problems? Because in the immediate aftermath of the Trump election, various parts of the market soared because they thought this is going to be a brand new world of deregulation.
No, absolutely. And it was interesting to see that it did last for a little while. And now, of course, everyone, certainly if you look at last week, have been beginning to worry a little bit about the impact on world growth, but also what will happen to interest rates and inflation. Because obviously, if you impose tariffs, then whatever comes into the country is going to be more costly. That's in the US. And that, of course, will affect supply chains and everything else. And I think there is going to be, like there has been before, when Trump had imposed all those aluminium and steel tariffs, when he was president last time, businesses were lobbying very, very hard because, of course, as their costs increase, the difficulty of passing it on to consumers is a very obvious one. And, of course, it also affects their competitiveness. So there is a big, big issue there to be discussed. And I think in advance of any announcement, there is going to be an awful lot of, going up to Washington and lobbyists sort of being incredibly active in trying to see how they can limit some of the damage that will happen. And of course, the impact for the rest of the world and China. There is a big issue that if the UK and Europe do not respond in a similar way, a lot of goods will be dumped from China into the UK and the US. And of course, the car industry is an obvious one, which is right now suffering.
Vicky Price, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
Contact us at ubs.com.
Finally, on today's programme, the latest edition of the seminal French dictionary Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française is published, and it's already been considered to be out of date. The volume, which was presented to President Emmanuel Macron last week, took no less than 8 decades to produce and has been widely condemned as a bit of a white elephant. Well, Philippe Marlière is Professor of French and European Politics at University College London. A very good morning to you, Philippe.
Good morning.
I mean, this is an enormous event in every single sense. It's got 400,000 words in it.
As you just said, when it comes to the time taken for producing that 4-volume dictionary, it started, in fact, in 1980. So it's a very long time. And of course, people wonder whether all those entries are still up to scratch.
So just explain to us why people are worried about this, because it's being published online. But the fact is, if it's going to take you 8 decades to do, and frankly, that's given me such reassurance in so many aspects of my life, which I haven't completed. But when it takes 8 decades to make, the relevance of a lot of the words is going to be put into question, isn't it?
Absolutely, because, of course, languages change, evolve. And if it takes so much time to produce a whole dictionary, I think you can bet that some entries will be totally out of date. And I think it shows very well, because the last part of the dictionary, from the letters R to Z, to the very last part, seems really to try to include the sort of a more modern way of writing and speaking the French language, as opposed to the earlier ones, where clearly the Académie Française really got stuck at trying really to keep up, or to use a kind of a very pure but out of date French language. There's a big issue, for instance, which regards the feminization of nouns and jobs. And the last entries, from a letter R to Z, include female alternatives to it, whether at the beginning, of course, you don't find it. So it's not very consistent. And it's clearly not, doesn't reflect the way the French language is spoken and used by French people themselves.
Tell us about a little bit more about the people who actually combined this. I mean, they are called the immortals of the Académie Française, the sort of those who defend the purity and the integrity of the French language. I mean, they're a fantastic looking bunch, for starters, with some excellent white bow ties. But their relevance is perpetually being questioned, isn't it? Given the fact that some of them were elected as long ago as 30 years ago.
Absolutely, and once you're elected, you can remain in your position for life. You may resign if you should you want to, but I think you can. It's really a job for life. And it's a very old institution, first of all, which was created by Cardinal Richelieu in 1635. So, that's a very long time ago. At the time, it made sense because there was no unity of the French language. It was, of course, there were still different regional languages spoken across France. Of course, that's no longer the case. The French Revolution suppressed it. It was it was set up again by Napoleon in the early 19th century. So I think it's a very strange institution, to be fair, because their role is to really keep the purity of the French language. But of course, there's always a gap between what the academiciens, the so-called immortals, regard as pure, correct French language, and the way that the French themselves, the French population, use and write their own language.
And indeed, how the irresistible aspect of time changes everything as well. Philippe Marlière, thank you so much for joining us here on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks too to our producers, Vincent McAvinney, Chris Chermak and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Sana Jimani, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great week.